I want to acknowledge a couple of groups of people who might be here today. If you are a former member who has come back to celebrate with us, would you either stand or raise your hand so that we can acknowledge you? Thank you for being here and welcome back. And then if you are part of, we might call the founding generation of the Preston Road Church. And let's just say if you were here in the 1940s and 50s, would you stand or raise your hand? We are here today because of you and those around you. Your faithful, steady service to the Lord and to this church means a great deal to me. And I have been so thankful to get to talk to members of that generation and hear their stories about what it was like. And it was a cold November morning, about 50 degrees outside, November 1939, on the corner of Preston and McFarland, and about 30 Christians gathered for the first service of what would become known as the Preston Road Church of Christ. It was that concrete house you can see in that photo. They gathered that day. They'd been saving all year to make a down payment of $500 toward a $10,000 note. They took up a contribution that first day, and let's see if you can guess what their contribution was on that first Sunday. Was it $34, $153, $457, or $1,000? Who wants to vote for the $34.61 amount? Raise your hand. Let's get votes. Some of you think that. All right, $153.44. $457.83. Okay, and $1,000.06. The correct answer is $34.61. Now, I'll let you check that amount against our contribution in last week's bulletin. Things have changed. But if those Christians were like the church I know now, they were diligent financial planners and they were careful to steward the generosity of the church well. And so those who made that down payment and signed that $10,000 note, they had counted the cost and they paid off that note with a final payment of $2,000 just 4 years later. In Luke chapter 14, Jesus has a crowd following him. And seemingly unprompted, he just turns around and teaches the crowd. They hadn't asked him a question, as happens sometimes. Jesus just turns around and says some things to people following him. Perhaps he's worried that he's got a bandwagon. The people have just jumped on because Jesus seems like a great teacher. Maybe he has some good life hacks to teach them, and they don't know what's in store. And so Jesus wants them to know that following him will require great sacrifice, even carrying their cross to their own death. And in this teaching, Jesus imagines two absurd scenarios. Here's the first one. He says to them, "Suppose one of you wants to build a tower. Won't you first sit down and estimate the cost to see if you have enough money to complete it? For if you lay the foundation and are not able to finish it, everyone who sees it will ridicule you, saying, 'This person began to build and wasn't able to finish.'" Or the second scenario, suppose a king is about to go to war against another king. Won't he first sit down and consider whether he is able with 10,000 men to oppose the one coming against him with 20,000? If he's not able, he'll send a delegation while the other is still a long way off and ask for terms of peace. In the same way, those of you who do not give up everything you have cannot be my disciples. Now, Jesus here is not just talking about an accounting ledger or having enough money in your savings account to pay your bills. He is telling people, though, that discipleship will come at a cost, and they shouldn't be surprised when the bill comes due. Sometimes we may know what's ahead in following Jesus, and sometimes we may have no clue. In the 4 years that it took us to pay off our first note, the church grew and was running out of space. Worship was flowing downstairs. They were meeting upstairs in that house, and people were flowing downstairs for overflow seating. So they launched another campaign to raise about $35,000. And they told the church of a great new facility they were going to build. This is the building we thought we were going to get in the early 40s. There's a picture, that painting hangs outside my office. People thought they were going to get that, but little did we know that World War II was on the scene and we would soon enter as a country, and so things changed. Materials became scarce and labor was pricey. The difficult times. So even though we had a good amount of money and we even had another campaign to raise another $25,000, we scrapped plans for that building, and instead there was a presentation to build just a $12,000 temporary frame building onto that old concrete house in 1946. So that's the building we thought we were going to have. This is the building we did get in 1946. There's some historical notes from the time that the leaders presented that to the church, and it reads, when the church heard it, all were disappointed, but not a single word of dissatisfaction was uttered. I find that hard to believe. Might not have been uttered out loud to the leaders, but they were uttered. But at that time, we counted the cost and made a different decision. Sometimes when you count the cost, you have to get creative with your solutions. But you know what happened? Even in those years, because we built a bare bones addition onto that house, we were able in those years to support a church plant in Cedar Rapids, Iowa. We paid the minister's salary so the church could focus their monies on their own building. And even in that embarrassing frame building compared to what I know were the churches around here, we sent 3,000 postcards to the neighborhood inviting their kids to Vacation Bible School. We made it work in that frame building, and we continued to meet. But a few years later, it was time to build a proper church building, and so we proposed a new build in 1949 and 1950. There was a problem logistically because we had this piece of land, and so we were going to have to tear down what we had. And so for a year, we met Highland Park High School Auditorium and Inwood Theater. We met at some nearby Churches of Christ for midweek services. And in 1951, the building we are now in, this sanctuary we are now in, opened. But we weren't just focused on ourselves. In those years, we supported missionaries all over the place out of our generous hearts and wallets. You saw that tongue-in-cheek article earlier from the Christian Chronicle about our big budget of $1,000 a week. But we supported missionaries in Africa and Hawaii, Germany, Brazil, Taiwan, Belgium, Hong Kong. We supported domestic church plants in New York and Minnesota. We even planted a church up the road at Walnut Hill and Marsh, known as the Walnut Hill Church of Christ. And then in the 60s, under visionary leadership from Minister Eldridge Stevens and the current elders of the church, we started a school to train preachers. In fact, if you Google Preston Road School of Preaching, you will find it listed in countless bios of preachers, even current preachers in Churches of Christ. So while we were growing at Preston and McFarland, we were also expanding our impact around the nation and around the world. In the late 1970s, we added on the narthex, the lobby area you see surrounding this. We were destined for greatness. But then we got a surprise bill. On a cloudy Tuesday night in 1979, the cost skyrocketed.
The 4 people killed in that crash were members of this church, the Preston Road Church of Christ in Dallas. Along with Eldridge Stevens, head of the church's School of Preaching, were killed Rudell White, Raymond O. Evans, and Thomas W. Dockery. All were instructors at the church-run school. The church's switchboard was busy today relaying the tragic information of the crash.
Wiped out the whole faculty of our School of Preaching.
At a specially called meeting of preaching students and congregation, The emotion over the loss of the four seemed obvious. Elred Stevens had been the pastor of the church for 14 years before concentrating his work solely on the preaching school, and the other 3 men had been his support team. Church members were asked to be brave.
Thanks be to God we do have a shepherd. And we just need to call on him. Pour our hearts out to him. And tonight that's what we're going to do.
The School of Preaching has 60 students, and according to church leader Tom Gomer, it will survive. Gomer says for the time being, the school will use part-timers and volunteers to teach courses, but the loss of the 4 goes deep. The church says there will be a special devotion held here tonight because of this tragedy. A tragedy it says it will survive because of its faith and its belief that there is a reason for all things. Noah Nelson, the Texas News.
4 members of that School of Preaching faculty were flying back from ACU in a small prop plane, attempting to land at Redbird Airport. The dense fog caused Eldred to have to switch from visual landing to landing by instrument only. And the plane crashed in a ditch, killing all 4 of the men you saw mentioned. It made national news, especially in churches of Christ. What does a church do after something like that? How does it survive? Some might not. And in fact, membership did decline in the 80s. It wasn't all of a sudden. It might have been a slow trickle. It was for various reasons. But the leaders of this church knew that they needed to forge a fresh path. So you have Jeff Nelson on the scene, leading out in worship arts and drama. You have different preaching under Julian Goodpastor and Randy Mayu and Lynn Anderson. And within a decade, visionary members here started reaching out to the city and the world in new ways. Now, many of these people prefer not to have their names used in the founding story, so I won't use their names, but I know who they are. I know their humble hearts. Many of them are in the room today, and I'm thankful for them. They're part of the reason my family and I chose to come here. In the late 1980s, some members were tired of watching people dig for food in dumpsters and started a food pantry, moved over to Henderson, and eventually became Central Dallas Ministries and what we know today as City Square. Started people at the Preston Road Church of Christ. Church, with God's help, you did that, and I'm thankful. A few years later, a woman named Amy walked into our building, and she was in a job that exploited her and her body, and she wanted out of that job. And women here surrounded her and helped Amy and helped Amy's friends. And what started out with small garage sale type fundraisers has morphed into large events at key downtown hotels with nationally known speakers, and it is known now as New Friends, New Life. Don't think that in those early days, that didn't come at a reputational cost for the people who were involved. Church, you did that with God's help. I'm thankful. And then a few years later, Scott Sager was doing his doctoral project at SMU and wondered who the underserved were in this part of Dallas. Because of his work and others who surrounded him, we now have a clinic in our basement that sees patients daily who do not have access to affordable, quality health care. Church, you did that. I'm thankful. I told you when we launched our Deep and Wide theme years that we were going to look for a new area of service to Dallas in our era. We have started and supported all these great works, but they're not just nostalgic remembrances of the past. Preston Road, we are not done doing big things, not even close. Last Saturday, our ladies' Bible class hosted a luncheon with the Human Impact, focused on unhoused people and just treating them as fellow human beings with dignity, speaking with them, praying with them, feeding with them. There are other organizations we're partnering with in smaller ways. And so we're going to spend some focused time, as I told you, after the first of the year, discerning and asking God to show us new places that our time and talents and money might best be used. This church continues to use our gifts to serve others, and we are nowhere near done. So I want to end with a bit of history that might give us some perspective. Many of us are having a hard time right now seeing past Tuesday. We're anxious. I am too. But we started here in 1939. And so, for the history buffs, who was president then? This guy. And since 1939, we've been meeting here while all these other people have been president. We've seen some good ones and not so good ones, and we might not all agree on who the good ones are. But we have survived good and bad, and through it all, we have served the Lord faithfully. And Lord willing, we will continue to serve faithfully through the next president and the one after that and the one after that. And do you know why? Because in every generation, we have sat down, we have counted the cost, and we've decided it is worth it. So church, congratulations on our 85th anniversary, and here's to many more. Let's stand.